Welcome back to our third lecture on reform movements in the 19th century, and I want to wrap things up for the week talking about women's not liberation, that's the terminology for 20th century reforming, but women's equality movements, abolition, and the backlash. The culminating event of the 19th century that is seen as the birth of a unified women's suffrage movement takes place at Seneca Falls, New York, between July 19th and 20th, 1848. This is the first women's rights convention held for women to gather and to declare as a group their push for equal political and civil rights. Essentially, this is a meeting for an organization to organize, to unify these women, these various groups to work together in order to achieve a common goal. And what Seneca Falls is going to produce is a declaration of sentiments, which lays out women's issues and women's problems in American society. It's a call for national reform that echoes the Declaration of Independence because it actually uses the same framework and language as the Declaration of Independence for its body. It is simply edited by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and others to reflect the needs and desires of women in the 19th century. So this is really the great stepping stone from which the push for women's civil rights and political rights moves forward. All right, we really need to talk about abolition because it's the elephant in the room as far as 19th century reform movements go. Now, I want to talk about why I have this image here on the right. Slavery in America begins with the first Africans arriving in 1619. We have a tendency to say, oh my God, 1619 was 400 years ago. Yes, that's right. This year is the 400th anniversary of the arrival of slaves. But we ourselves are not that far removed from the effects of slavery in our society. Segregation ended in 1954. No, we're not going to talk about that in this class. That's less than 90 years after the end of the Civil War. Pardon me. If you look at this graph, 1900 is in that yellow range. Well, 1900, that's 119 years ago. My grandmother was born in 1919. Being born in 1919 meant that my grandmother lived at the same time as people who were enslaved. The last woman brought directly from Africa to the United States on a slave ship and sold into slavery died in 1937. That means within the lifetime of my grandmother and your great-grandparents, former slaves still lived among us. The past isn't all that past. By 1860, there are 4 million enslaved human beings living in the United States. These are spread throughout the country. One of the things I want to make sure that everybody remembers, when we look at the Civil War, and I'm going to say this again when we get to the Civil War, but when we talk about the Civil War, hey, the North wanted to end slavery, the South had slavery. Yes, by the time of the Revolution, northern states were beginning to end the practice of slavery. There were still slaves living in those states by the early 19th century, and just because institutional chattel slavery did not exist did not mean there was not racism. Racism was a national issue. But the reason that the North did not have slavery by 1860 and the Southern states did was because the Southern economy relied on slave labor as a free labor input that reduced the cost of raising cotton and tobacco, which meant that commodity crops were profitable to sell. If you look at how you make a profit, if you own a business, you have to count in the cost of the materials, the cost of shipping, and the cost of labor as some of the inputs to determine the unit price required in order to make a profit. Enslaved African Americans were not paid. And so infrastructure to feed them, like food, clothing, housing, is spread across all property and is considered a part of the property, and it's not really considered an input. They're free labor. Many people also, and the reason that not only does the Southern economy rely on the production of agricultural commodities like cotton and tobacco to make a profit and drive the American economy, farming in the North develops on a much smaller individual scale, and we don't have a great commodity crop in the 19th century that requires constant slave labor to take care of it. You're always chopping weeds in a cotton field. It's very hand labor intensive for harvest. It's hand labor intensive to plant. In the North, we're raising corn and wheat and livestock. And yes, you could make the argument that we could use slave labor to take care of these crops and commodities, but it would not have existed on the same scale as Southern agriculture. Moreover, we have the issue of people calling into question declaring independence from Great Britain at the same time that we own slaves. And for many people in the North, where there are larger religious communities, because there are larger communities, more and more people call that morality into question and push for the end of slavery. Abolitionists want the immediate abolition of slavery. Now, this is important because not every state, and in general, the states did not do immediate abolition. How did the northern states end slavery? Vermont is one of the few states that immediately ended slavery by banning it from existing when they wrote their Constitution in 1777 as a new state. There's one thing to keep in mind. There were almost no slaves in Vermont. It was very easy for them to do that. In other states where there were more slaves, they took a gradual emancipatory process. Slavery in Massachusetts is the only one that does not end because of constitutions or laws. What we would call activist judges in the 20th century, 21st century, end slavery through a series of court cases, essentially brought by one man who sues for his freedom, and through several court cases, and the judges that decide those cases find for his side and end slavery for him, which ends slavery for all people in Massachusetts. By and large, the mechanism for ending slavery in the North is gradual emancipation. How gradual emancipation works is a state legislature sets an arbitrary date. Any date or any person born after that date is not a slave, but they generally have to serve a period of time that they'll call an indenture, generally freeing them between the ages of 18 and 25, wherein they are trained to be workers for future jobs, but in reality, they're still free enslaved labor for the person that owns them. It's just that after a certain age, those people will be set free and no longer work for that individual. Their parents, who were born before that date, are enslaved for the rest of their lives. So it is quite possible for you to be born into freedom, reach the age of 25, earn your emancipation, and your parents will die a slave. In Connecticut, we'll see the passage of anti-slavery laws for gradual emancipation in 1784, and slavery will not end in Connecticut until 1848. In New York, it's nearly 30 years from the passage of the abolition laws until slavery actually ends. And in New Jersey, the first laws to end slavery are passed in 1804, and ultimately, slavery is ended by the 13th Amendment in 1865. So there are still slaves living in the North during the American Civil War. So what are we going to do if we free the slaves? This is why that comment about racism still existing in the North is so important. Just because we want to end slavery doesn't mean that people want African Americans living amongst them. And so the answer for a great percentage of the American population is colonization. Groups like the American Colonization Society will work to emancipate slaves, to end their slavery, and then to remove them from the United States and resettle them in Africa. There is a very real fear that whites and blacks cannot live together, either based in a racist belief that blacks are inferior, or in a more common belief that African Americans may very well rise up and take out the aggressions of slavery on white society and wipe us out, to cause unrest because of what white people have done to them. Colonization societies will also work for free African Americans, those who are not slaves, to be removed from America themselves. This is also, we need to understand that even Abraham Lincoln supported colonization until the 1860s. Lincoln felt that the injustices of slavery would create such resentment that in order to preserve American society and prevent violence, former slaves needed to be removed and sent back to Africa. The reason we say sent back to Africa, and we literally established colonies, the nation of Liberia has its roots as a former slave colony where the American Colonization Society and other groups sent freed African Americans to recreate a society of their own, because there is not just a fear of backlash and slave rebellion. There's also a belief that some people believe that these former slaves have the right to self-determination and the right to create a society of their own as they see fit. They don't have to necessarily have African or American values thrust upon them. Now, one thing to keep in mind, there's an incredibly high death rate in those populations that choose to repatriate back to Africa. There's a racist scientific belief that blacks or Africans, I'm sorry for using some of these terms. I sometimes personally struggle to use the proper terminology in society. African Americans are believed to biologically be established or set up to thrive on the African continent. If you're born in America, you haven't been exposed to the tropical diseases that kill so many people in that climate. And so you haven't built up an immunity. It's literally the case that I believe nearly 5,000 settlers are sent to Liberia by the 1870s, and I'm trying to remember the statistic off the top of my head. And to be brutally honest, 2/3 of them die of tropical diseases by 1873. Of the nearly 5,000 people that are sent over, less than 2,000 survive into a period of establishment. There is no biological aspect to race. There is no biological aspect to culture. These are all social constructs that are developed amongst people. There is no biological definition or differentiation based on race. We can't say that people are better set to survive and establish societies in one area or another based on the color of their skin or how they're biologically constructed. Biologically, on a DNA genetic level, we are all the same. We just didn't understand that in the 19th century. The first real true abolitionist society that is set up that believes that African Americans have a right to be free and a right to live in this country as citizens is the American Anti-Slavery Society. William Lloyd Garrison will begin the American Anti-Slavery Society by establishing a newspaper called The Liberator in 1831. This is a weekly newspaper based entirely around the ideology of freeing the slaves. It is a radical abolitionist newspaper that is distributed everywhere by the mails in America. And Garrison is going to be a constant agitator against slavery. The only time that he is not going to push for slavery being ended is after the 13th Amendment is passed and slavery legally ends in this nation. He is literally going to close the Liberator. He's not going to find a new cause to fight for. He's not going to keep it in print for other reasons. Once the 13th Amendment passes in 1865, William Lloyd Garrison is going to publish the final copy of the Liberator because his work is done and slavery is ended. He sees the Constitution as a corrupt bargain born of the devil because of the Three-Fifths Compromise, the the fugitive slave clauses, and the work. The word is slipping my mind right now. The compromise made with Southern slave owners that enabled this country to be born. He sees the United States as a corrupt institution because of the permission of slavery to exist, to the point that he is going to burn copies of the Constitution at meetings of the American Anti-Slavery Society. By 1838, there are going to be 250,000 members of the American Anti-Slavery Society. And in their founding document, their Declaration of Sentiments, they even quote the Bible. The same document the slaveholders are using to justify the existence of slavery. They're going to quote the Bible is that every American who detains a human being in involuntary bondage as his property is a man-stealer. You're not just immoral because of something that the New Testament might have said. You are breaking the laws of Exodus. You are breaking the most basic laws that God has given his followers. And when we say that abolition becomes a constant agitation, abolitionist pushes are everywhere. These are pages from a reading book for young children where they learn their letters through reading poems, and the poems are all abolitionist poems. A is an abolitionist, a man who wants to free the wretched slave and give to all an equal liberty. B is a brother with a skin of somewhat darker hue, but in our heavenly Father's sight, he is as dear as you. C is the cotton field to which this injured brother's driven, when as the white man's slave he toils from early morn to even. D is the driver, cold and stern, who follows whip in hand to punish those who dare to rest or disobey his command. We are indoctrinating young children from a very early age into this belief that slavery is bad. This is not a book universally used for all children. This is simply a book given to other children or children of abolitionists for them to learn. This is not allowed in the South. We see broadsides such as this by the American Anti-Slavery Society denouncing slavery in the nation's capital. America is a slave market. Slavery corrupts our nation because it is present in our nation. The enslaved even built our houses of government. This is something relatively recent, even in the representation of American history. We have only outwardly acknowledged the use of slave labor within the last decade at the Capitol itself. We see men such as Frederick Douglass joining the cause of abolition. Frederick Douglass is one of the great abolitionists in this country's history. He himself is a former slave. In 1838, he will escape his master from Maryland, and he will spend the rest of his life laboring to end slavery. He will tour Europe. And in 1846, while he is there in Europe, the people that come to see him, the English supporters of anti-slavery, and keep in mind, England will end slavery in the 1820s. We are hanging on to a dying institution in this nation in the 1840s and 1850s. In 1846, while Frederick Douglass tours England and Ireland, his supporters are going to raise enough money to formally purchase his freedom. Just because you escape slavery doesn't mean you're free. Prior to 1846, between 1838 and 1846, Douglass lives under the constant threat of arrest and the return to slavery because he is somebody else's legal property. And he is never going to truly evade that threat of arrest or assassination. He's also a great supporter of women's rights, and when the Seneca Falls Convention occurs in 1848, Frederick Douglass is the only African American attendee and pushes these women to declare their desire to have political and civil rights. He is a very vocal supporter of the women's suffrage movement. What I want you to do when you get a chance after I give this lecture, please click on the links at right here or on the left. Wow, my directions are really crossed. Please click on these links. These are going to lead you to Frederick Douglass's most famous speech. On July 5th, 1852, Frederick Douglass is called to speak before an Independence Day rally in order to talk about the meaning of freedom. And Douglass really does take it upon himself to call out the hypocrisy of having an abolitionist address a 4th of July Independence Day rally. His speech is called "What is the 4th of July to a Slave?" James Earl Jones gives us a 4 or 5 minute snap look at a portion of the speech. The full speech is over an hour long. When you went to a political rally in the 19th century, man, you went there to hear speeches and to be entertained by long orations. And Douglass gives a full, lengthy oration. So read the text of the speech, but also give James Earl Jones's delivery of the speech a listen. It is a powerful moment in history. So who opposes reform movements? Reform movements are seen as, honestly, reformers are overzealous nuts. They're out to ruin life for us. I want you to sit back and think about how people react to calls for changes in society today. It never fails. There are some people who hear, "Oh, we need to change this, we need to change that." And there are some people who automatically react with, "Oh my God, I'm tired of hearing this crap." The reaction is the same in the 19th century. We get tired of being yelled at all the time that this is wrong and that is wrong and life sucks and we're horrible people and we need to stop doing things and we need to give women the vote. We don't react well to that. Reformers are nut jobs, as some people say. The very concept of abolition is a threat to the existence of the United States itself, because Southerners, even in the 1830s, as we talked about with the nullification crisis, have already threatened to tear apart this nation based on a tax, a tariff. If we pass a national law to end slavery, the South will leave. It will tear apart the very fiber of this society. Mobs will destroy printing presses that publish anti-slavery materials. People will be killed for being anti-slavery advocates. These are the most violent responses to reforms. Everybody else is going to be ridiculed. How deep is this response about protecting slavery? In 1836, Congress has received so many petitions from citizens and citizen groups asking for them to pass national laws about slavery that Southern Democrats will pass and enforce a gag rule, which means they will not allow for the discussion of slavery on the floor of the House of Representatives. This gag rule is going to be effective for the better part of a decade. For a decade, the Democratic Party is going to prevent the discussion of slavery in Congress through informal rules on the House floor. We're going to talk about the difference between Democrats and Republicans once the Republican Party actually exists in the confines of this class. Do not tie the actions of the previous Democratic Party of the 19th century with 21st century Democrats. They are not the same. But I will hammer this in lecture at a later point. Generally, this is the attitude towards reform movements in the 19th century. This cartoon represents various reform movements in their appeals to John C. Fremont and the 1856 Republican Party platform. The Republican Party is very liberal at its creation, and as such, various reform movements move forward or move towards the Republican Party to have a political voice in this nation. The gentleman at far left is pushing for making tobacco illegal, but also making meat illegal and beer illegal. Next to him is a woman who's smoking and wearing a bloomer suit. We demand the recognition of women as equal of men and the right to vote and the right to hold office. But this is a figure that is very mannish in her portrayal, as being in the way she is portrayed as a woman. She smokes. She has a riding crop. She's actually wearing men's pants and not the bloomer pants that were illustrated in the drawing that I showed in the previous lecture. So she is acting as she's being portrayed as masculine as possible and not a woman. The impoverished drunk is asking for an equal division of property so I don't have to work. We have the free love movement represented here. The free love movement was essentially a polygamous movement, or a movement. It's not Mormonism as practiced in the 1840s. It is essentially a movement that legalizes people having sexual relations with anybody they choose because of the very strong laws based in sexual mores and religious beliefs of the era. Essentially, the free love movement is portrayed as wanting to destroy marriage so that ugly people can have sex. You can see this in the way the woman here is portrayed. We have Catholics represented in this cartoon. Catholics are seen as second-class citizens who want to destroy society because of their belief in the power of the Pope. And this priest is saying, we look to you, sir, to place the power of the Pope on a firm footing in this country. And we have the freed African dressing in a comical style that is trying to copy upper-class whites being portrayed here looking for equality. Fourier, if you look at Fremont's response, you shall all have what you desire, and be sure that the glorious principles of popery, which is Catholicism, Fourierism, which are communal living, free love, women's rights, the main law, and above all, the equality of our colored brethren shall be maintained if I get into the presidential chair. We're mocking all of the reform movements and a new political party all in one fell swoop. Thanks for paying attention this week. I hope you have a great day. If you have any questions, please get a hold of me. I'd be glad to talk to you. Have a great day.